Panasonic, the heart of your system.
Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and after spending the last 3 or so months looking at Nvidia's GTX 16 series, today we are returning to the RTX series, and specifically we're looking at this card here. This is Gigabyte's RTX 2060 Gaming OC Pro 6G. So if we look at Gigabyte's lineup of RTX 2060 cards, this is actually the top end model if we don't include the Aorus card, which is kind of in its kind of own little sub-brand. So for an actual Gigabyte branded card, this is their top end model. It comes factory overclocked with an 1830 MHz boost clock, and it also comes with a £31 price premium over Nvidia's Founders Edition. So the question we are really going to be asking throughout this review is whether or not this particular card from Gigabyte is worth that price premium. We'll kick things off with a look at the design then, and having now reviewed a number of Gigabyte cards over the past few months, they all generally look pretty similar. So they've all kind of got these matte black kind of stealthy looking shrouds. There's a couple of grey accents on there, but it's mostly matte black. And then generally the design is quite simple. There's nothing that kind of stands out and really grabs you about it. That's not necessarily a bad thing though. As we mentioned, it is actually very colour neutral, so you'll have no issues putting this in a colour coordinated build. The only downside is, and I think it is a fair point, is that it could be a little bit more exciting to look at, but it's hardly a major point. On the front of the card, we also get a look at those 3 fans. Each of these measure 80mm in diameter, and they actually feature what Gigabyte calls its alternate spinning technology. So if you look closely, you can actually tell the middle fan the fan blades are oriented in a different direction to the outer 2 fans. So those outer 2 fans will actually spin counterclockwise, where the central fan will spin clockwise. So Gigabyte says this is designed to reduce overall turbulence and thus increase airflow pressure, but we're going to look at temperatures and also noise levels later on in the review. Just moving back to the card as a whole, it is worth touching on its dimensions. It measures 280.35 by 116.45 by 40.24 millimeters. So it's definitely not the biggest RTX 2060 we've seen. That would be the Asus ROG Strix model, but then again there are actually a number of single fan RTX 2060s on the market, so they would be considerably smaller. Still, as far as cards go, I would expect this to fit in the majority of cases on the market. Moving on now to the front side of the card, this is where we find the Gigabyte logo, and this is actually the only RGB lighting zone on the entire card. Personally, I quite like that, as I prefer kind of a more minimalistic look, something that's not too in your face. But then again, it does depend, as we have seen a number of other 2060s which have multiple RGB zones across the entire card. So just to point out, there is only one RGB zone, so I guess it really does come down to your preferences on RGB lighting. Flipping over to the backplate now, it's again quite plain, which fits in with the overall design language, with just the Gigabyte logo for embellishment, which is printed in white. Remember, it's not an RGB zone. Although it is good to see that the backplate itself is made from metal, and it does contact the rear of the PCB via some thermal pads. So not only will it help with overall structural rigidity, it should also help with some heat dissipation as well. Lastly, we'll just touch on the single 8-pin PCIe power connector, and then also our display outputs, of which we have 3 display ports and then 1 HDMI. Taking the card apart now, this only requires the removal of 7 screws from the backplate, and then we get direct access to the PCB. Here we can see that Gigabyte has gone with the same 6+2 power phase configuration as Nvidia's Founders Edition 2060, and we can also see that the 6GB of GDDR6 memory is supplied by Micron. As for the GPU die, this is labelled TU106-200A, and it is that A which signifies the fact that this is a bin chip which can indeed be sold with a factory overclock. Now, as for the cooler, this is actually comprised of 3 separate aluminium fin stacks, all of which are connected by 4 6mm copper heat pipes. These heat pipes actually make direct contact with the GPU die, while it's also good to see Gigabyte has supplied plenty of thermal pads for both the memory chips as well as the VRM. Moving on now to performance, and it's worth saying in this video we're going to be showing you guys our 1440p benchmarks. We do of course have 1080p and 4K benchmarks over on kitguru.net, but considering now we kind of know what to expect from a factory overclock 2060, we're going to be focusing on the 1440p charts. So if we get those charts up for you now guys, as expected, the card really does perform pretty much where we would have thought from a factory overclock card. Bear in mind this has a 150 MHz clock speed advantage over Nvidia's Founders Edition. Accordingly, throughout our test, it does beat the Founders Edition in every single benchmark, and it performs on average 4% faster. So it's not a massive gap, but definitely it does come in faster across every benchmark. Another interesting point of comparison is actually with Vega 56, which is on average 7 to 8% slower than this gaming OC6G. That figure really doesn't tell you the whole story though, as it actually does vary quite a lot depending on the games you're playing. In titles like Deus Ex Mankind Divided, for instance, Vega 56 is actually marginally faster than this 2060, but then again in others like Ghost Recon Wildlands and also Shadow of the Tomb Raider, it is considerably slower. So again, like I said, it really does vary title by title. Still, as RTX 2060 cards go, this is definitely one of the faster ones out there, and it makes it great for both high refresh rate gaming at 1080p, and then also very solid kind of looking between the 60 to 70 FPS region when you bump up the resolution to 1440p. Now, as this is an RTX card, we also looked at some titles which do have ray tracing enabled. In particular, we looked at Battlefield 5 and Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Here we ran both games at 1080p and 1440p, first testing with ray tracing off and then with RTX set to Ultra. RTX 2060 is definitely best suited to ray tracing at 1080p, and in actual fact in both titles we saw around, I think it was 60 to 70 FPS when we had ray tracing enabled and set to Ultra. That is definitely a playable frame rate, but then it is still about, I think it was 35 to 40% performance penalty when you go from RTX off to RTX Ultra. For me, both titles are obviously still playable when you do enable RTX, but it really does come down to personal preference whether you'd rather have the higher frame rates with RTX off, or you don't mind dropping down to around the 60 FPS region and having RTX on. So it really does come down to your personal preference. Just to round off our performance section now, it is also worth looking at the real world clock speed of this Gigabyte card. Like we said, it has a rated boost clock of 1830 MHz, which is 150 MHz faster than Nvidia's Founders Edition. In the real world though, we actually saw it boost up to 1938 MHz on average, which is 106 MHz faster than the 2060 Founders Edition, and it is just that gap in frequency which explains why we're seeing slightly higher frame rates from the gaming OC Pro. So that is it for our look at the gaming performance, but what about thermals? Well, the card didn't actually run any hotter than 64 degrees under load, and that is actually a fantastic result. It's a full 5 degrees cooler than Nvidia's Founders Edition, and you can see on the chart it definitely comes in as one of the coolest cards on test today. This excellent thermal performance is backed up by the excellent acoustic performance as well, as we actually saw this card produce the least amount of noise other than any card that wasn't a GTX 16 series card. We know those cards are generally much less power hungry, so less heat equals less noise. But of all the cards we tested, apart from the GTX 16 series, this was actually the quietest card today. It's so quiet, it's really just at the point where once you actually do put it in a case, you'd be really hard pressed to actually hear the fan spinning at all. Power draw is also worth touching on, and we saw the total system draw 246 watts with this Gigabyte card installed, and that is about 20 watts more than with the Nvidia Founders Edition card, although again that really is to be expected considering this Gigabyte has higher clock speed and thus higher power draw. We'll also touch on our manual overclocking now, and overall we did okay with this Gigabyte card, although I would have liked to push it a little bit further, but the best we could do was add an extra 95 MHz to the GPU core, while we could add 1000 MHz to the memory. This actually brought our real world clock speed up to 2008 MHz, which is a real world increase of 70 MHz, which is definitely good, although we have seen other 2060s which can run closer to 2040 MHz. So like I said, it's good, but we have seen better. Still, this extra frequency did see our Firestrike score increase by about 5%, and then also playing Deus Ex Mankind Divided as well as Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1440p, we also saw our frame rates increase by between 3 to 5 FPS. It was also good to see that the card dealt really well with the extra frequency too. The GPU temperatures only rose by 1 degree, and then in terms of total noise output, this didn't even rise by a whole decibel, so again, a fantastic result. Power draw did also increase, but again, it was a very marginal increase. I think it was only by about 6 watts or so again, really nothing to worry about. So then, wrapping up this review, I think it is fair to say that Gigabyte has made a very solid RTX 2060 offering in the form of this gaming OC 6G Pro. It may not be the flashiest of cards in terms of both the design and the feature set, but I think it's clear Gigabyte is definitely focusing on the fundamentals. That's because not only is it very fast thanks to its factory overclock, but it also runs very, very cool and also very, very quiet. That does mean it is one of the more expensive 2060s though, as this one comes in at £360, or £31 more than the Nvidia Founders Edition. I do think it does just about justify that higher price tag because, like we said, it is an improvement over the Founders Edition in every way. That being said, it doesn't offer as attractive value, especially because there are now some actually entry-level 2060s on the market for just £300. I would also say any prospective buyer may be advised to look at Vega 56 cards as well, especially as they can now be had for just £279. Like we mentioned earlier, Vega 56 is on average between 7 and 8% slower, but it really does depend on the title, so it may be worth just looking at the specific games you play and seeing how Vega 56 compares to an RTX 2060, because actually in some instances we saw Vega 56 pull ahead of the 2060, although then again in others it can be up to 13% slower. On the whole though, it is my view that the RTX 2060 is still the best mid-range card to get. And while this Gigabyte model does come in about 10% more expensive than Nvidia's Founders Edition, it is definitely a very solid all-round offering from Gigabyte that runs fast, it runs cool, and it runs quiet. So then that is really it for my review of the Gigabyte RTX 2060 Gaming OC Pro. I'm just going to wrap this one up here, guys. As you can probably tell, my voice has been going for about the last 5 minutes, so it's been a little bit of a struggle. But if you like this video, you can toss us a thumbs up. Also leave a comment below, let me know what you think of this card. You might have also noticed my t-shirt. This is a new one. I think it came in last week. We've got a range of designs on our merch store down below if you'd be interested in picking one of those up. And if you'd also like to get a look at our content early, you might also want to consider backing us on Patreon. Until then though guys, I'm Dominic for Kit Guru, and I will see you in the next video.